which is basically first blockchain platform in Singapore to issue the education certificate on blockchain. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Martin, and I'm also working as a software consultant at Zeniga. And I've been in software development for 9 years, and also building enterprise apps using web components for more than a year.
Yeah. So today's agenda is we will go through the basics of web components, and then we'll talk about the elements of web components, and we will build a to-do demo using web components. Can we see? And after that, we will build a chat application using Lit element, which is one of the web component framework. And then we will talk about how we can integrate web components with the existing project, which uses third-party library like React, Angular, or Vue.js. Excited? Yeah, it seems so. Okay. So, web components is the set of standards to write modular, reusable, and encapsulated HTML elements. Basically, in today's world, if you are working on the front-end side, so before proceeding, I just want to ask one thing. How many of you have worked on web components? Like, raise your hand. Ever heard of web components? Okay. How many of you are working on the front-end framework, like any framework, heard of components? Okay. So basically in today's world, everything is on the components. Everything is component, which can be reused, encapsulated, and can be modularized for your application. So every framework, React.js, Angular by Google, or anything, they have all introduced components. But the only problem is, like, technology is evolving really fast. So if any of you have worked on Angular 1, and when it switched to Angular 2, it was the drastic change. The whole application was broken and they were written from the scratch again. So you cannot depend on the third-party library framework always. For that, web components has been there since quite a long time, but since quite few years, the support on the browser for web components has been drastically moved, and now most of the latest browser supports the web components. So why they are useful? They are framework agnostic. They don't depend on any framework, and they are written in vanilla JavaScript. You don't need any kind of secondary language for that. So why web components? It's basically HTML is not semantic enough to understand. There is no standard templating system. There is no native encapsulation in browser. Basically, you can not encapsulate your styles or your markups so that it don't get overwrites by the global or parent CSS. There is no way to reuse the existing HTML, and everything is component, as we talk. So what are the goals of web components? It's basically to reuse our existing code, to encapsulate the styling and markups. It provides the separation of concerns. It provides the better composition. And for theming purpose, it's really best when you want to provide the theme to your application. And it's pretty much expressive because you define your elements by yourself, and it's semantic. This is the browser support. Basically, if you see, most of the latest browser supports web components, except for the Internet Explorer, which is still developing the support for especially custom elements and Shadow DOM. And apart from that, Chrome, Opera, and Safari pretty much support web components. So these are the 4 parts of standard web components, basically templates, imports, Shadow DOM, and custom elements. Templates are nothing but reusable HTML, which you can define and reuse in your application. Imports is basically introduced in ES6, if you know. They are basically to import the HTML file in your application. It gives the flexibility so that you can write your web components in .html file and import in another HTML. Shadow DOM, it's basically to encapsulate your markups or CSS. Hello. Yeah. And custom elements, which basically gives you the flexibility to define your own elements. So let's talk about every standard of web components. So custom elements, it basically gives you the flexibility to author your own component. You can name your own component my cool component or whatever you want. And you can define your component and tell the parser how you want to parse it in your application. What are the events you want to handle on that event? What are the markups you want to handle on that particular element? So how elements of that particular class will react to some changes. You can pass the props, you can pass the attributes, you can define properties on that particular elements. And custom elements always define in a prefix hyphen name. So you will always have a hyphen between the custom elements so that it doesn't get messed up with the native HTML elements. Next one is Shadow DOM, which is basically to encapsulate your styling and markups. So whenever you define a Shadow DOM, it's basically attach a DOM subtree to your DOM root. And that DOM subtree is encapsulated and doesn't get overridden by your global scope CSS or markups. It's really great for modularity so that you can just use that modular components anywhere in your application. ES module is nothing but it's for reuse and inclusion of the JS documents. In part, it's also, you can use it for HTML and CSS to import in your application. HTML templates, it's basically defined using template tags, and it's good because this HTML template code doesn't run by itself until you activate this code. So any kind of image, any kind of script written inside that HTML tag won't get loaded until you will activate this particular code. These are the lifecycle provided with the custom elements. It's basically a constructor is by default with any class you can define. Connected callback is every time your components get created and it gets attached to the DOM tree. Similarly, disconnected to clear your memory and deattach your events. Attribute change callback, it's similarly whenever you pass a property or attribute to your components, this particular lifecycle method will get called. And adopted callback is nothing when you reuse your custom elements from one DOM elements to another DOM elements. So here is the short definition when you can use the constructor. It's basically whenever your element gets created, your constructor gets executed, and it's good for setting up the initial state, event listeners, binding the event listeners, and creating the shadow DOM. Connected callback is when your custom elements inserted into the DOM, and it's basically good for fetching data, making AJAX call, and setting the default attributes in your application. Disconnected callback similarly to deattach your event listener or cancel time interval, free up memory of your application. Attribute change callback is called like anytime your element observed attribute changes. So there is this static method which is provided in the custom elements, observed attribute, where you can define your variables or observables which is going to change in the future. And these attributes can fire this attribute change callback lifecycle method every time. So it has 3 parameters: name, old value, and new value. Name is basically the name of your attribute which you have defined. Old value is the previous value, and new value is the change value of that particular element. Adopted callback, as I told you, like whenever you change your DOM or move your DOM to a new document, it gets called. It's basically useful when you are using iframe in your application. And there is one more method which is available, which is custom elements.define, which is used to register your elements into the JavaScript. And it uses custom elements registry, and it defined using window.customelements.define. You will give the name to your element and provide the class you have created for that particular element. So this is the application we are going to build now. So before that, I'm going to start with one basic example, which is hello world. And for that, I think everyone is connected with the Wi-Fi, right? So one thing everyone can do, can download HTTP server. I think 1 minute. Everyone has NPM with them, right? Installed on their computer. Yeah. Just install this HTTP server, which will help us to basically run our server, and we will use this to run our website.
So y'all had discussed a little bit. I think 2 people can keep it.
Sorry, guys. Popular.
Maybe move the table in a little. So you can
You have place to sit?
I'll see if we can fit one more table. I use Sunday. This table and the spare. If there's more people coming in, then we'll try to open it up. Yeah, so sorry guys, thanks for waiting.
Okay. Okay, so for the new people who had just arrived, we have just gone through the basics of web components, its definition, and what are the parts we are going to use to create our web component. So we are going to start with the demo of Hello World, which is the basic demo, and we will modify that demo to create a to-do app later on. So I hope everyone has installed the HTTP server, which I'm going to use to run my server. And I think everyone has installed the HTTP server, right? Yep. Let's just start with adding one index.html file. And we will add the body tag in it. And if you want, you can add the head tag with it also. Okay. With that, we are going to include our JavaScript file, which we are going to create. So I'm going to give a script tag a source that I'm going to create one file, helloworld.js, which will be included here. And this hello world file will define a web component, which is hello world, which later on I'm going to use it. Okay? This is the very basic HTML file in which I have a body tag, and I'm loading one script, and I'm defining one web component. Let's open a new tab and write a JavaScript file. So we are going to use the self-invoking function. Basically, we don't want to expose our context to outside. So I'm going to use the self-invoking function, inside which I'm going to define a function basically. This is the self-invoking function in our hello world.js, and in with this, I'm going to define a class hello world, and so every web component, every custom elements we define, it extends one class which is HTML elements. I'm going to inherit that class. Okay, so let me just save these files so that it will look good. I will give it a name index.html. and I will save this file as hello world.js. Okay. So first of all, we have defined a class and we have extended the HTML element. HTML elements gives us the flexibility to attach all the native HTML elements properties to our custom defined elements. So now we are going to use the custom elements.define property to define our element. So we will write and we will give it a name hello world, and we will type the class here. So this line tells JavaScript, okay, this is the hello world tag which has been defined by the user, and it can be used as a hello world in my index.html where I have loaded this. Everyone's okay? Yeah. Now I'm going to define the constructor, and I'm going to call the super here. Super is basically to inherit the props from your parent class, which is in our case HTML element. So before that, I'm going to need my template also. So I'm going to define a constant template, and I'm going to create my template here. Okay. Now I'll say I'll just put the inner HTML to some div hello, and currently I'm just going to put it as a world. Now I'm going to attach the shadow with the mode open. I will explain this mode later, like why I have used this mode, and I will tell it as like yeah.
Would it be possible to increase the font size a little bit?
Okay. Better?
Yes, that's great.
And I'm going to append this as a child, my template dot content dot okay, so what I am doing here, I am in this current context, I am attaching the shadow DOM, and in the shadow root, I am appending my template content and cloning its content to its shadow root. So now let's try to execute this code. You can just run your server using npx http-server. And just copy paste it.
Error.
Yeah. Let me just check.
You took close the door. This is that. Email HTML. There's the closing.
Okay. Which one was there? This one.
Don't assign it. It will automatically.
Nope. Let me just open the another window.
It's your HTML. HTML has not loaded. HTML. Index HTML.
Inner HTML?
Index HTML. Another file. Index HTML. Index HTML. Yeah. HTML not closed.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Okay. So we have our hello world here. Let's try to modify this hello world code, and I'm going to put a dynamic content here with the hello Sumit or something, and we will pass this name as a property to our web component. Okay. So as we said before, what all the selectors or all the template starting will be here in connected callback. So we are going to define another cycle method, connected callback. And I'm going to say this dot element is equal to this dot shadow root dot query selector, and I'm going to select the strong here. Okay. And I'm going to use the attribute change callback lifecycle method also, which is going to update our inner HTML of the strong. It basically takes 3 parameters: your name, your old value, and the new value. So I'm just going to do this dot underscore element dot text content is equal to new value. And so when we define a variable properties or attribute on a custom elements, we learned before that we have to define a static method which is observed attribute inside which we are going to define the attribute. So we are going to define this method here, static get observed attribute, which basically returns the array of all the observed value. We are going to give this attribute a name, and even you can check it here if you can just call it here. And we are going to pass this name as a property here. Okay. So everyone is following here?
I have a question.
Yeah. So,
Why do we need to define the static method again?
ah,
This one didn't catch.
this basically defines in your custom elements what are the variables are observable in your custom elements. So which are the observable variables you are going to define in this array. So any other property if you want to pass like anything, name, surname or year, date of birth, you can define it here. And whenever you will use this attribute and you define different kind of name here, suppose I'm going to say, so this observed value will call this attribute change callback method. 1 minute, let's listen. Element strong. Switch.
I've had these situations in the office. Like set up a problem for a whole day. The next morning, I looked at it again. I was sick of it. Come over, have a look. I started explaining it, and 30 seconds in.
So change callback. So the attribute name.
No, but it's kind of a
The text content.
and
Choose anything.
changed, right? So that's why it's changed.
Yeah.
You're using the observe attribute.
Which one?
The first observe attribute with an S in the end.
Let me just check. This not. Okay. I think I need to define it here. Yeah. Okay. So there was one problem. We need to define the element inside the constructor where we are using our query selector, and inside the attribute change callback we are defining the text content using the new value. And if we will run it, you will see like for different instance of our hello world component, you will have the different value with it. And if you will see the source code for this, you can see the shadow root in your inspect element, and you can see a open written after the shadow root. This open basically gives you the flexibility to access the reference of your custom shadow root outside the DOM. So after this shadow DOM, if you want to reference your hello world element, suppose document.query selector hello world, and you want to perform any operation with the open method, you can do that. As soon as you will make it closed, you won't be able to access the reference to the hello world of shadow root outside this particular template. So this is the dynamic method. Next method we are going to try using slots. So everyone is following, or okay? So next method we are going to try using slots. Slots are nothing but a placeholder in your template which gives you the flexibility to dynamically change the content of your template. So instead of using the strong, I am going to use the slot, and I will give slot has this name property with which you can reference the slot in your application. So it's basically I am going to say, okay, my demo is the name of the slot, and I'm going to comment this. I don't need. So whenever you use float, you don't need to pass this property. Instead, you define your native HTML elements, and like div, and you give it a slot property, and inside this you will reference your slot name, which is basically my demo. And you will pass it over to it. And I'm going to write something. Similarly, I'm going to use it here. Another div, and I'm going to write JSConf. Yeah. Let's try. Yeah. Yeah.
the JS change?
Okay. In JS, instead of a strong selector, I have used the slot, and I have given it a name, my demo. Then I don't need to use the query selector or anything in my template. Okay, so this slot will give you the flexibility to add the dynamic elements in your custom elements. Suppose you have defined some UL attribute and you want to have the dynamic li attribute inside it. You can define that using slots in your application.
So do you have two slots there? Because the second one doesn't have a...
Sorry, it's just closing.
Okay.
Sorry.
That's the closing one. Then we don't need to find the strong one. Yes. And then the attribute change, can you scroll down a little?
There is nothing else. All the code is commented. You just directly put the slot, that's it.
Go to page 3.
So what
Funny thing is-
why the second hello world has a slot as an attribution?
Which one?
The second hello world,
Yeah.
the slot.
I'm referencing the same slot, but the content is changing between both elements.
Are these same thing?
This is the same element, but the inside content is different. There is JSConf text, there is so much.
The slot attribute is on hello world.
Yeah, that's same. So slot is a placeholder in your components, elements, basically, which is dynamic. It's basically the children of your elements, which is purely dynamic and variable. Sorry. So this section which is here, okay, I have defined this slot, I have given it a name to reference it into my HTML, to reference it into my any other HTML or components where I want to use this slot in my template. Okay.
Well, it's not showing up for us. The second one.
Second part,
The slot, the attribute on the hello world is not showing.
here.
Yeah.
The JSConf is not showing in our laptops.
Okay, one minute. Check.
I have only the first one.
You have defined this slot. Okay, where is your HTML? Yeah. You have defined slots. Hello world closing, div closing. Where is your JS? This is your JS. You have defined slot. My demo. Hello world JSConf. Where is your browser?
Why I can't find
And this is
That's not working.
Stop.
No, it's like it's a big
Yeah. I hear you're running this code.
Yeah, actually there is just this error which you are using. You have defined this slot here on your element. You have to define it into your HTML element.
But why the second one is not working? The code is the same.
Okay, no, this is going to work. 1 minute.
Right here. But it also, this is the second time I tried to before I just had to go my directory and then I pulled out.
And just check.
Just normal.
Sorry.
Slot on.
You have just need to define this slot here. So you have defined this slot here. You need to define this slot on your element. Okay. Now it should work.
Yeah, I know this.
Okay.
Your code, your product.
Slot my demo. This is wrong. No, you cannot do that. Okay, one.
That slot should be on the demo.
Yeah, that's why it's not working. So the slot should be on your native HTML elements where you are going to define or which part you want to make the variable and reference it in your templates basically. So this part is going to be variable for a placeholder for my custom elements. So I'm going to define the slot here and give it the text. So if anyone's code is not working, please make sure that you have defined the slots on the native HTML element. Yeah. Everyone is okay? Okay. Okay, so for the to-do demo, I'm going to use this one. Can you please clone this code on your local system? We are going to use this repository, which is basically for our to-do demo, and the next application, chat application, we are going to use it. It has two folders. One is completed code, which you can use it for reference, and one is our demo, which we are going to work on.
Sorry, excuse me, can you click the page larger? The URL?
Yeah, 1 minute.
The big reference name.
I'm going to paste it the repo name.
This is the booty.
So everyone has cloned the repo. What okay?
Once you refresh, refresh, see the flash?
Yeah.
It shouldn't be right.
No, I mean, this is the one that you sent me. It like is besides Google the and it's the quotation mark. So it's like reading it as a quotation mark, but the C16 is a string.
Wait, open the browser.
I think I need to check it. There should be flickering shouldn't be there somehow. I don't know. If you not fetch it from the
It's still flash. Okay, you can see.
okay. Normally it doesn't do that. That's the like flexibility of web components. It just only changes the text itself so that it won't give you the flicker. Everyone has cloned this repo? Wi-Fi password is here. Wi-Fi password is written here. Password is JSConf Asia. Wi-Fi is Lazare JSConf. So anyone need it, please copy and paste it here. Okay. So in your code base, there would be two folders. One is the chat demo and one is the to-do MVC. We are going to cover to-do MVC right now. Later on, we will check the chat demo, which is basically using the lit element. And for your reference, there is completed code is also written in the demo complete, which you can check out later on if you need the reference. So for to-do MVC, we have defined 3 components for our application. One is the parent component, which is to-do demo, and then to-do list and to-do item. To-do list is the wrapper component, which is going to render all the to-do items inside it. So let's start with the to-do demo, which is our first component which we are going to write. Similarly, like hello world, we have defined the templates here, created a template, and put one inner HTML here. In the inner HTML, I have defined 3 sections basically, header, section, and footer. Header is nothing but your input box where we are going to type the to-do demo. Section is the list, which will show you the to-do list, and footer is show you the count of the to-dos which are active right now. So this is our template which is going to render in our application. We have defined this to-do demo class, and we are going to define this element first. So let's use window.customelements.define, and I will give it a name to-do demo, and I will pass the class here. Okay. Now let's go to our constructor. It says we need to bind these 2 methods first. So we are going to bind the method this dot new to do cleanup, and we are going to bind another method also. Now in our connected callback, we are going to append the host. So before that, we also need to define the we have also defined the disconnected callback, which is basically just to remove the event listeners or unnecessary cleanup on our code. So we are just going to use this dot inner HTML, and we are going to assign it append the term. Okay. Root dot append child, we are just going to append the content of the template here. Next, we are going to bind some event listeners, which we are going to use. I'm going to reference them from the complete demo. I don't remember actually. Okay. Okay. So we are going to use keyup and to-do list change event listeners. So keyup is basically nothing. When we press the enter to our input box, we are going to add that to-do into our demo. And to-do list change is nothing but to refresh the count in our application. We are going to remove this listener in our disconnected callback. So I have just copy pasted this listener cleanup from the completed file. So I have added two listeners, keyup and to-do list change, and removed these listeners in our disconnected callback to clean up it. Apart from that, I'm going to need few query selector to put the operations, to put the event on my to-do list. So these are the query selectors, which is basically I'm going to use. And so our to-do list query selector is nothing but the placeholder which is going to show the list of all the to-dos in our application. And new to-do class I have selected to attach the event to our input box in our to-do demo. Then another main class, which is basically nothing but the section class. The list of to-dos, we are going to perform some operations there, like delete, remove, or edit. And the last but not least, to-do count, which is basically we are going to show the count of our to-dos in our application. Okay. So let's try to run this code for now and see the UI, like how it looks. Okay. So if we will run this code, this is how our UI will look. We have put the CSS and everything already there in our HTML file. And if currently I will do anything, it will do nothing for me. Okay, so what we have done till now we have defined the to-do demo custom elements. And inside that element, we have defined our templates for to-do demo, which is basically the input box and the list we are going to show, and the footer section. Inside that template, we have also introduced one another custom elements, a to-do list, where we are going to render all our to-dos. Inside our connected callback, we have used all the query selector to perform the different operations, and we have attached all the events, key up and to-do change. And then we did the cleanup in our disconnected callback. And these methods, I'm going to explain it later on. Let's go to our to-do list file. So to-do list, inside to-do list, if you will see, we have created a template elements and give it a slot. So slot is nothing but the variable content inside your template. So here in this section, we are going to define some content, we are going to add some content, which will be your particular to-dos content or text, which we are going to show there. So as we saw in our Hello World example, we are going to append templates to our shadow root. So before that, we are going to attach the shadow with the mode open. And we are going to clone our template. Okay, everyone is following? Sorry. Before that, we also need to define our components actually. In our connected callback, we are going to add one listener to listen for the slot change. Every time the content of the slot will change. And in our disconnected callback, we'll similarly remove the listener. So every time our slot content will change, what we will do, we will remove all the nodes which are unknown to the to-do list elements. So for that, we are going to use the node type element, which is nothing but we are going to loop through all the child nodes and we are going to check for the node type. If node type is 1, which is basically tells it's a native HTML element, and we are going to check its tag name. If it's not a to-do item, we are going to remove it from our list. And then we are going to dispatch the event, basically. So I'm going to dispatch this custom event to-do list change, and with that I'm going to deliver the to-do item element counts, which are basically all the counts which I have assigned to my slot here. So this can be accessible through assign nodes to that particular slot. And this slot is nothing but the query selector of this slot, which we have initialized in our constructor. Let's see what it will change. Not detail. Start on this class. To do element count. It's an object. Yeah, I have created it an object.
You should put
Okay. To-do list change. To-do list change. New custom event. To-do list change. And to-do item element count. Let me just check it from here. Just dot dispatch event, it's dispatching the same. Sorry. It's going to be here. Okay, so this to-do list is going to give us the functionality to listen for that to-do change event and update the number of to-dos we have added. So now we need to add the list of to-dos which we are going to show down here. For that we are going to work on to-do item. So by default, whenever you define a template and shadow root, its host element has the styling markup of inline. So by default, it doesn't take the height and width. So it's better for you to define some height and width on your host. So you can either change the styling of your host or put some, and if you don't need the height and width on your host, you can just use the existing styling. So here I'm going to give it some styling from my to-do item. So for my host, I have made it display to block and added some border and font size here. We will add all the styling later on, it's just CSS part. Again, we are going to similarly define the elements first. And similarly, we are going to attach the shadow and clone the template into the shadow root. Clone node. Apart from that, I have added few methods which are basically checkbox or different operation on our to-do, which we are going to see later. And similarly, I have selected few elements from my to-do list templates. So this is my templates for the to-do. You will see there is an input box label to assign the label for my to-do. Destroy button, which is basically to remove the to-do. And there would be an edit button to perform the addition on my to-do. Inside connected callback, I have just added all the listeners on different, for a particular to-do, what I'm going to do. I'm going to add the, edit the to-do, change their text, remove the to-do, and update the to-do. So I have added different kinds of operations, click events and double click, and blur events. And in the disconnected callback, I just remove all the listeners attached. And in attribute change callback, I'm going to just check for a switch case, which will check for if it's a label or completed, and I'm going to assign the value to it. So it's nothing but this code. So what I'm going to do, if my attribute name is label, I'm just going to make it text content to the new value, and my attribute is completed. I'm going to mark its checkbox as a checked with the this.completed property. One thing you can also notice, we are going to define these two properties as our observable also. So I'm going to define these here, label and completed, basically. Okay, let's try to run it. Set and getter, setter and getter for the values. I'm going to define the setter getter also. Sorry. Okay. Once we define, I have put some code in hurry, getter and setter code inside it, which is basically used to set or get your observable properties in your custom elements. So I have used two methods, set completed and set label, and similarly get completed and get label, which is basically to set our observable attribute. And these are the different methods which we are going to use to make our to-do list to perform different operations. Basically, we are going to blur the text as soon as you click on the checkbox, and you can double click on the to-do list to edit it. And there should be a remove button. Okay. Checkbox check completed. Okay, so we are missing some CSS here. I'm going to copy paste it from the original elements. Yeah, so this is all. This is our to-do list demo using vanilla JavaScript. Next, we are going to look into lit element, which Martin is going to explain. But before that, we are going to take a break for 10 minutes. Yeah.
For the second part of our workshop. So, we just witnessed how we can able to build web components using just vanilla JS without using any library or using any framework. But for the second part of the workshop, we will be using lit element. So there are already libraries and frameworks that helps us to build web components. So libraries such as Hybrid, Polymers, Kate.js, Lit Element, Slim.js. These are the libraries that we can use for us to be able to build web components a bit faster and easier. So for the frameworks, we also have this custom elements everywhere.com, wherein it lists all the it shows us how compatible the framework is when it comes to the web components. So we can try to take a quick look. So for this one, we can see that Angular has a good rating, AngularJS, Hyper HTML, Lit Element, Polymer. I think React is somehow a bit low when it comes to web component support, but hopefully in the future they will cover most of the features. And yeah, Surplus, Blue, Svelte, and Vue. So yeah, also apart from that, I guess frameworks like Angular and Vue also had their own tools. For instance, for Angular, they have this Angular element. For Vue, they have this Vue web component wrapper, if I'm not mistaken. And also Stencil also is a framework that helps us to build web components. So yeah, we're going to use Lit, but what is Lit Element? So Lit Element is basically just a base class for creating fast, lightweight web components that work in any web page without any framework. It uses lit HTML, properties are observed by default, elements update asynchronously when their property change. So we can think of somehow lit element like an enhancement or an improved version of the HTML element. So lit HTML is the templating library that we're going to use later on. So basically, lit HTML allows us to define or write our HTML templates using just plain JavaScript with the use of template literals. So if you notice on my right side, you'll see this is how Preact VDOM re-renders or reruns every time they have an update. While on the left side, this is how lit HTML does its re-rendering. So if we take a look at the H1 element, what happens is the whole node is actually being re-rendered. While in lit HTML, only the dynamic text, which those numbers represent, are the only ones who's changing. So thank you for Codeverse for the image. And yeah, so basically somehow lit HTML is a bit or slightly faster compared to VDOM. It's like 30 to 40% faster depending on your browser. And then I think the only slight problem that we have for lit HTML is actually during its first render, it's somehow a bit slow. But yeah, I think in the future they will improve that, because actually lit HTML is not using any VDOM overhead, or it's not using any diffing algorithm. It's purely using web standards. So it's leveraging the web standards, like it uses the built-in parser, HTML parser of the browser. It uses weak map, tag template literal. So for this slide, I want you to somehow focus a bit on the template bindings, because this is what we're going to use mostly later on when we're building our chat component. So to do attribute binding, we just simply do, let's say, class attribute, then the data CSS class. Nothing that special, but when it comes to Boolean attribute, we need to use question mark. For property binding, we need to use the period. And for event binding, we need to use the @ sign. So as I mentioned earlier, lit element is like an extension of HTML element. So all the life cycle that was mentioned by Sumit earlier can still be used when building lit element. But apart from that, lit element added some couple of life cycle, but I won't be able to discuss each one by one, because we won't be able to tackle everything for this workshop, as we don't have that much of a time. But just to give you a quick overview, the lit element update cycle starts when we set a property. So then afterwards, lit element will request an update if there is a change in the property. So by default, it checks whether the old value is equal to, or not equal to the new value. So after that, it will do the perform update, then should update. This should update is somehow similar to, I guess, the React lifecycle component should update, wherein by default, this one returns true, but if you want to somehow prevent the component from re-rendering, you can return false on this part. For the update, no need to override, no need to implement. It's just it's just lit element has this lifecycle in between should update and render, wherein in this update, the reflection of properties to attributes is happening. And then we have this render. This one, we will use this one most of the time. This is where we define our HTML templates. And the first updated is like, this one is, once the template has been created, it will be called. But this one only happened once, so any one-time work that you need can be implemented here. And then the updated, this happens once the updated or the element has been rendered. And finally, the update complete. Actually, this update complete is not a method. It's more on a property that resolves into a promise. But this one we also won't be covering for this workshop. So in lit element, we declare properties somehow like this. We need to type in static get properties, then return just an object with the property name, then the property options. So for the property options, mostly we will be using the type, reflect, and no accessor. So for the type, these are the types, the default types that we have for lit element is string, object array, boolean, and number. So for the attribute, this is we're not also going to tackle that, but if you see, if by default, if we do reflect, if we mention that reflect is true, then if we change the property to value to something, it will get reflected to an attribute also called as property 2. So if we specify an attribute, it's like just whenever prop1 has changed, the value will be set to the, or will be reflected to the my-attribute, attr. So I guess that's it. These are the property options that are available for lit element. So what we're going to do for today is we're going to build just a simple chat component. So it has 4 components. So the first one is the chat demo. This is the main component or the entry point component. So in this one, we will just need to identify whether we should show chat lobby, where you can see once we're so at first we will display the chat lobby, then afterwards, once we enter the username, we now see the chat room with the chat messages. So I think we can now start. So I hope that a while ago that you have already downloaded the repo that was mentioned by Sumit. So if you can go to the inside demo chat folder, you'll find the client folder. So for this one, we have 5 folders. One is Angular. One is for Angular, one is for React, one is for Vue, server, and client. So for the integration, it will be covered by Sumit afterwards. So basically, in these folders, this Angular, React, and Vue folder, we will see how we can integrate the chat component that we build into these frameworks. So for now, the client component that we're going to build is located in the client folder. I also have server folder. It's just a plain WebSocket server. If you want to try or run, but this server is actually not necessary. If you can skip it for now. but we will be able we will see just a single error when we're building. It's like WS or WebSocket connectivity error, something like that. But it's okay because it will not crash our application. So running server is like an optional thing. So before we begin, first is we look into the package.json. So what I have here is just using, of course, the lit element. I'm also using the OWC dev server, but we can also use Polymer CLI if you want to run your server or any server. But for this workshop, I prefer to use OWC dev server. And we just have a rollup for bundling. Maybe afterwards we will use this bundling just to somehow integrate the chat component into React or Vue. And yeah, I only have start and build script. So first what we need to do is, I guess, we need to npm install. Yeah. So now let's create a source folder. src, then in here we'll first create the chat message. By the way, for this one we'll just use plain JavaScript, but you can also use TypeScript if you want. But yeah, for this workshop, it's just purely JavaScript. So first thing to do is to import the lit element and the HTML and the CSS helpers. So yeah, now let's start creating our class. So let's name this one as chat message, which extends, instead of HTML, we use lit element. So somehow this looks familiar because somehow this is similar to what we did earlier when we're building web components using vanilla.js. Also, we need to define, let's call it chat-message, and the chat message. So for lit element, the three basic or requirements that we need is, first is we need to define our template. Second is also we need to provide our styles. And yeah, we need to render it. So let's start first by creating a render function. So we need to this is where we will write our HTML template. So just to check that this is somehow working, we can just write chat message and then go into the index HTML. Then for this one, we'll use ES6 module. So type should be module, then source. Let's point it to the chat message. And now we use the chat message. So to run this one, we should be able to run it just npm start, and yeah, should be good to go. Yeah, so yeah, we were able to create our first component, but of course this is not final yet, but we can somehow see that we already have our chat message working. So what to do next? The next thing to do is we should define our own styles. And just simply, so for this one, we need to use the CSS helper. It's similar on what we did for the render. And then we put in our style. So for now, let's just see whether we can add background. And let's just say that this one display black. Yeah, so we were able to apply our style. So actually we can add our styles here as well. We can add these style or external style sheet. We can add it here. However, as per lit element, it is highly recommended to use the static get styles instead, because somehow what lit element does is it tries to use the constructible styles sheets object. So if the browser supports the constructible style sheets object, somehow what the constructible style sheet object does is it allows us to parse and reuse these style sheets only once. So for maximum efficiency, they're using constructible style sheets as well, only if the browser supported it. So I think one more thing that we need to do, of course later on we're going to change the styles and the template. So we can also define the properties. So first is we need to return an object. Then let's say, I think for the hello world sample, if I'm not mistaken, we use name as the property. So we can also do that. Then for the type, it's just string. Then we tell lit element to reflect whenever the property changes. We tell lit element to reflect the value to the attribute. So to see that happens, let's use the property that we defined under properties inside the render. By the way, if we need to somehow initialize or have a default value for our for our properties, we should do it in the constructor. So let's say the default value for name is equals to hello. So if we go check here, yeah, we see, sorry, it's not that clear. Maybe we can change the color to white. Yeah, so now we have the name property. The name property default value is hello. So there's two things that we can check here. Is first is, since we mentioned that whenever our property changes, it should reflect to this attribute. So yeah, we can try that here. Let's say we change the name to, well, yeah, we see that this changes as well as the attribute here, the attribute name here. But what if we change this, or we remove this one? What will happen? So what will happen is, whenever we change the name property, yeah, it will not just reflect. So if we want for a property to get reflected to the HTML element, we just say reflect to. So I guess that's the, basic to get us started for building this chat message. So starting now, I might need a bit of a copy paste skill. So let's go on to the chat message. So for this one, I'll be copying this one first. And then for the properties, we're going to have two properties. One is from and the other one is outgoing. So what this is from is, it's more on the name of the server, so that we will be able to see in the chat message where the message came from, who's the sender of the message. And outgoing is just a flag for us to identify whether it should be a line right or a line left. So I also need to copy all the styles. Yeah. So I think we now have, or we have now completed the chat message, but just to have a quick idea of what is happening on this render portion. So first is, whenever this or the from property changes, we will get the value, and if the from is null or undefined, or it's not set, so by default we will have the anonymous as a value. Then the initial is just like the first, we'll get the first letter of the name. Yeah. Then for the HTML template, first is just the badge wherein we just pass in or bind the initial. Also, we did the same for the name. And we're also using slots, because for slots, we want the content or the content of the template of our HTML tag to be projected on this portion. So if we now try to modify this chat message and we add, let's say, Martin, then say hello, JS con. So now we have this element. So we can also see how it looks when it is an outgoing. Oops, sorry. So basically, if it's outgoing, the direction will be on the right side portion, but if it's not, we should see it on the left side. So since we do reflect, so we should see outgoing here. So I guess since now we have the chat message, we can now proceed on creating our chat room. So we first create a new file. So since we already done the basic steps, so as much as possible, I want you to create this chat room, maybe just the skeleton, wherein you add or you import the lit element, then you write in the class with a chat room message that extends lit element, then add the static get properties, static get styles, and the render. Also, don't forget to define your element to chat-room. So yeah, so I hope that you'll able to come up with this structure. So first, what I'm going to do is, we need to have two properties, username and the message list. So we can type it in. String and a message list, which is an array. So for this one, I'll just copy the styles. And I'll just quickly copy the render. So if one thing that we use in these styles is, if you're familiar with CSS variables, the native CSS variables, or let's say the custom CSS properties, we're currently using that here because later on when we try to integrate this one in React or in Vue, we will be able to somehow change the look and feel of our chat component. So for this one, I think it will be somehow, I assume that everyone have used tag, is familiar with tag template literals or template literals. So for this one, we can do the loop here, but we need to return the HTML element. If not, we won't be able to see this one rendered if we're not using the HTML element for displaying the element. So if one thing that we need to see is this one. So this, we use the Boolean attribute binding. So if in case you're wondering why we need to use the Boolean attribute binding for this one, if we change this one to this, we might get some error earlier in the future, because what will happen by default is if this message outgoing is not false or undefined, the outgoing value will be undefined string, which is not what we supposed to do. That's why we're using the Boolean, because if we use the Boolean, what happens is the value that this outgoing property will receive is just it's pure just true or false, not string Boolean. So I'll also be copying the rest of the code, I guess. So what we're doing here is first we define our own custom setter and getter. If you still remember earlier in the slide, I have mentioned the no accessor. So by default, lit element provides us the accessor. So they do implement the setter and getter by default. But for this case, we did our own accessors. So we added our own setter and getter. So for this one, we actually don't need these request update, because the we're not using the username for the rendering. So we don't want the lit element to re-render whenever the username property change. So one of the things that we need to take note is if we add our own custom accessor, we need to trigger the request update manually and pass in the name, like what we're doing here earlier. You need to pass in the name, for this case username, and the old value. For delete HTML to do its rendering again, we need to trigger this manually when writing our own custom accessors. But for this case, as I mentioned, we don't need this, as we don't need lit element to re-render whenever the username changes. What this does is just whenever we provide him the username, it will try to connect to a WebSocket server. And for the one of the lifecycle hooks that was mentioned earlier is the first updated. So in here we can have our reference to the input on this case, and also you can also put your, let's say if you're going to do focus on the input after the element has been created for the first time, you can do that on this life cycle. So I think that's it for the chat room. So if we go on to the index.html and if we replace this to chat room, I hope we should be able to see. Yeah, we're inside the chat room. So one thing I want you to take note of is if you see whenever we add in, oh, I have an error. Oh, okay. We need also to import the chat room, add the chat message rather, because we removed the chat message from this one, from index. And since we need the chat message inside the chat room, we need to import the chat message. So now we should be able, yeah. So, yeah. So, yeah, we just have this undefined error because we didn't provide a username. I think what we can do is, instead of we need to provide it. Yeah. So yeah, now we have this name and the message and the initial. So if you notice, we have this error, but we can ignore this one as I mentioned earlier. But for this one, I want you to take note of this, because what we did is whenever we add a message to the message list, it's like we're getting all the message and concatenating it with the new message. This is because by default, if we do mutation change on our array or object, lit element will not be able to know if something has changed on that object or on this array. So one thing we can do is we can actually try to use push, we can push the new message object instead, but for the lit element to be re-rendered, we need to mention the request update manually. But first, I just comment this one first so that we can see that our app is not working. I mean, we're adding, but it's not re-rendering because, as I mentioned, if we do mutate the object or the array, by default, lit will not be able to identify whether change happened in an array or object. So we need to trigger request update manually. So now if we type in, we see the same result. Yeah. So we can keep this one for a while. Yeah, can remove this. And now I guess we can start creating the chat lobby. So let's first create a new file and call it chat lobby. So we're just going to do the same thing. First is we need to import lit element, then the HTML and CSS helpers. Then we create our class. Let's name it chat lobby and extends lit element. Also, we need to define our element. We call it chat lobby. And we pass in the chat lobby class. Next thing to do is to write the static get properties if we need. But for this case, I think we need, if I remember it correctly. We also need, of course, to provide our styles. And lastly, the render. So for this one, I'm also going to copy and paste. I guess we don't have that much time. Yeah, so I need to copy the styles first. Or maybe just copy everything. So what is new here? I guess there's nothing new. It's just we're doing the same. We also have provided or exposing our CSS variables for the chat lobby. And then I think the new thing that we're doing here is we're dispatching an event, a custom event, which we did it earlier, I guess, in to-do list app. If you remember correctly, we also dispatched our own custom event. So we also added that here. So this is for us to identify whether the user have entered his name or not, or if he already wants to enter the room or not. So we dispatch an event once the room the user clicks on the join room. So for this one, we all did, as well as we bind the event. As I mentioned earlier, when binding event, we need to use the @ sign. And then, I guess we also did the event binding earlier. So we can, or should, we should now try the event, the chat lobby rather. For the chat lobby, we don't have any properties required. So if you notice, we don't have the static get properties. Yeah, and by default, if you remember earlier, we're manually cleaning up all the events that we have added for the to-do list app. But in this case, lit HTML handles that one for us, so we don't need to worry about cleaning up the events that we have here. But of course, if we do or if we add manually our own listener in this one, then we should remove that manually. But by default, if we use the lit HTML event binding, cleaning up the events is being taken care of us by lit HTML. So we now added the chat lobby in the index. So yeah, we're now able to see that this is the chat lobby. So I guess finally we need to create last component, which is chat demo. So I'll just copy everything. So for this one, there's only a few lines on the chat demo, because what this does is it actually just toggles the chat lobby and chat room. But for this one, yeah, let's try it first. For the chat demo, if you notice, we also imported the chat lobby and chat room. So we only have two properties, the joined and the username. So joined is just an indicator whether the user joined the room or not, and username. So for this one, if we can now see, if we type in our name and join the room, we were able to successfully hide the lobby and show the chat room instead. So another thing that we can do here is, instead of doing this hidden Boolean attribute binding, we can also have conditionals inside. So let's try that. So what we do, instead of hidden, we remove this hidden, or the we can. Yeah, we remove the Boolean attribute binding, so we can then check whether it's not, if the user is not yet joined, then we show the chat lobby. Otherwise, we show the chat room. So for this one, we also need to return a template result. So yeah, so we're just doing some ternary here. So we're checking if the user has joined or not. If the user is not yet entered the room, so we will display the chat lobby. Otherwise, we'll show chat room. Yeah.
Quick question on this one.
Yes.
Could this also just be a conditional in the render method itself?
Sorry?
Could this also be a conditional just in the render method itself? Like if joined, then render this HTML.
Yeah.
Joined.
Sorry.
So why you put the conditional inside another HTML block? Couldn't this just be a conditional in the render method? Like if this joined, then render this HTML. If not joined, then render the other.
Sorry, I don't.
If you move this join conditional up into the render method itself.
Oh. Okay. We can try. I haven't tried that actually. Mostly but I think it will still work. So it's like this one, right? Yeah, both will work, I believe. So let's return. Yeah, this right. Yeah. Yeah, it's still the same. But just to make sure that we have.
Second part should be else close.
Sorry? Just to make sure that this has changed, let's try to add a fake attribute, or say class. Fake class. So if we enter, yeah, so any approach will work, but I think, yeah, this one is a bit cleaner. So I guess that's it for the chat demo. For the integration of the chat demo, it will be done by Sumit.
So for the last part, we are going to use web components to basically see how we can integrate them with our existing projects, which we have already written in third-party frameworks. So, do you guys need a break before that? Okay, so we can have a 10 minutes break and then we can see how we can integrate it in our existing projects. With any third-party library framework. So I'm going to show you how we can integrate it with React, and there are similar steps which you can follow with mostly Angular or Vue.js or any other third-party library. There is polyfill you will need to install if you want your application to support for all the browsers, especially for Internet Explorer. And there is one polyfill available, Web Components.js, which you can always install to support it. Apart from that, there is vendor copy, which is available for React.js to copy all the vendor files into your own repository. So in your package.json, you can write a post install script, which is basically whenever you do npm install, this post install will get executed, and it will execute a vendor copy script, which basically takes the custom elements ES5 adapter and polyfill, which is web components bundle.js, and copy it into your public folder so that later on we can utilize this in our index.html. And in your index.html, you need to add these 3 files, 3 lines. Basically, you are including the same complete file in your index.html. That's it. That's how you can support it in your React or any existing application where you want to integrate the web components. So if you'll see, we have like one of the, we have put all the code for Angular, React, and Vue into the repository. If you want to look at it, look at them. Apart from that, if you will see here in the code base, so in my package.json, I have added my vendor copy script, which will do the copy of all the web component polyfill and ES5 adapter for me. And I have written this into a post install script, so whenever I'll do npm install, it will get executed. And in my app.js, I will just, if I'm writing my web components in this folder directory structure, I can directly import it here. For this, I have created that as a package, and I have installed that package, and I'm importing from that package chat demo, and I'm using that directly as a component inside my app.js. And if you will run this, it will be similar as we saw previously, and we can just execute this and use this command. So it's really simple to use web component in your legacy project or any existing project. You can plug it in any time in your any kind of project. And similarly, it's really simple to integrate with Vue. For Angular, it's a bit complicated, but we have provided some reference for them. You can always go through those links and check that. There are some best practices while you are working on web components. Always create a shadow root whenever you want to encapsulate your styles. Create your shadow root in the constructor always. Place any children the element creates into the shadow root so that it should be inside your DOM elements. Set a $host display style. By default, it's an inline, means it doesn't take the height and width. So it's better to set it to block or inline block or flex. It's always better to set the display property for the hidden attribute on the host. It's basically, you will never be able to assign the none property to a host element. Do not override author set or global attributes, the default properties which are used in a native element. Do not try to override them in your custom elements. Always accept primitive data as either attributes or properties. So whenever you are passing the data or passing some kind of booleans, numbers, or string, try to pass them as a property, as we saw like name in our Hello World example. Do not dispatch event anytime from a host to downwards to your children. Always pass them as a property or attribute. Dispatch events from your children to your parents. So as we saw to do change or other events which we pass from our children. Don't forget, it basically tells us like what you should always keep in mind when developing any custom element. Accessibility of your elements, it should like be accessible using the role attribute. If it's taking all the area attribute, if it can define, you should always put the accessibility of your custom elements. Performance, try to not use much of debounce or any other performance lagging method which can impact the performance of your element. A script isn't always the answer. if there is sometimes like you can use the native HTML only, don't always go with the web components custom elements. Be responsive, try to define your components in a responsive manner, and always test your components as much as possible. These are the references we went through to collect all the content, and if you want to go through it, especially the last three, which are used to integrate your web component with Angular, Vue, and React. These are really useful when you are trying to set it into your project. That's it. That was the workshop, and if you have any questions, you can ask anytime.